I'm Patrick Watson. I'm an astrologer, and you're watching 12 different types of Aries Rising. And now we're going to look at the next part, Aries Rising with Mars and Capricorn in the 10th. So let's take a look at the 10th house. So in the 10th house, the sun culminates in the sky. This is typically where the sun connects with the MC, where the meridian intersects with the ecliptic. So it's at its sort of highest point, in a sense. While the first house is who we are individually, and while the fourth house is like where we are from, and the seventh house is kind of like who we are with, the 10th house is what we do, what we aspire to. And this is why, in the height of the sun in this place, is sort of why the 10th house is associated with our actions and career and praxis, our reputation, as well as the topic of like bosses and authorities, kind of public lives. So planets which are in the 10th house are kind of motivated and kind of reaching a peak of activity or prominence, ready to make an impact. So they're very kind of visible. So what I like to call this position, Aries rising with Mars and Capricorn in the 10th house, I call this position the Bootstrapper, the Executor, the General. So this is someone who is characterized by their public influence, professional ambition, and intimidating reputation. Someone who aspires to high visibility and does what it takes to get there and stay there, although it can be a perilous place to be. This is one of the less common ascendant-ascendant ruler combinations in the Northern Hemisphere due to the short ascension of Aries, not Mars, and because Capricorn is one of the least common signs Mars can be in. So let's take a look at some of the examples I have of Mars in Capricorn with Aries rising, because you'll see how this kind of matches. So Richard Widmark was born with Aries rising and Mars in Capricorn, conjunct the Sun. And what's interesting about him is he was this acclaimed actor of villainous roles. So he was... oh, I also forgot to mention that it was opposite Pluto as well. So this is like kind of an insane Mars, right? But he was not a violent person at all. He was only famous for playing violent rogues and villains. So he didn't necessarily have like distinct Marsy traits. He just played them. He portrayed them. And, you know, this goes along with my observation that actors especially, you know, can play types of characters that are strongly suggested by their natal charts. So, you know, Mars can be kind of a villain. He first became famous for playing a psychopathic serial killer in the 1947 gangster film Kiss of Death. So I think this is, you know, he's not just Mars like an action hero, but Mars opposite Pluto, and even, you know, opposite Saturn out of sign. It sort of, you know, shows how he's can play much more of a malevolent sort of character. So after that movie, he played villains in dozens of movies. After that, he kind of got typecast as like a villainous character, and he eventually started appearing in more like action roles, more conventional. So he was, you know, he played cowboys and he played policemen and gangsters and military men. And what's interesting is that, you know, Widmark himself understood that you know, there was kind of a disconnect here, because he said, "I know I've made kind of a half-assed career out of violence, but I actually abhor violence. I am an ardent supporter of gun control. It seems incredible to me that the United States are the only civilized nation that does not put some effective control on guns." So, you know, he even noticed, you know, that this was something, you know, that, you know, he obviously portrayed, but, you know, was not actually himself. It's interesting to consider why he was not like the way he portrayed his characters by his chart. I'm not sure. Maybe it's the fact that, you know, Jupiter and Mercury are both trining or sextiling the ascendant or something, or maybe it's yeah, I'm actually not entirely sure. But what we can tell is that, you know, in a very public and visible way, he was able to portray these very Mars opposite Pluto type characters. Graydon Clark is a low-budget horror director. And, yeah, so he was born with Aries rising, Mars and Capricorn 10th. and he was known for purposely making these very popular, very profitable, low-budget B-style action horror movies. His autobiography was titled "On the Cheap: My Life in Low-Budget Filmmaking," and I just thought it was so funny because his economical filmmaking kind of matches the kind of bootstrapping, self-reliant nature of Mars and Capricorn. You know, it's very, very DIY style, right? And of course, Mars itself kind of more generally captures these themes of either action or horror. You know, it's the movies that make your blood pulse, right? He doesn't exactly do comedies, right? You know, he's doing action and horror. Now we have Robert Watson Watt. He is the inventor of radar. He was born with Aries Rising with Mars and Capricorn 10th. He originally wanted a job with the War Office, but instead he joined the National Weather Service. He was kind of relegated there. He didn't really want to do it. While he was there, he invented radar, which in some ways I really kind of see as the you know, his Mercury retrograde opposite Uranus, with the moon applying to Uranus and Scorpio in the 8th. Partly because you know, X-ray was invented when Uranus was in Scorpio, and stealth technology was invented during the 1970s Uranus and Scorpio period. So I think it's very interesting that, you know, both of those technologies have to do with seeing things that you normally can't see, seeing things you're not supposed to see. You know, X-ray, you're seeing through someone's hand. Stealth technology, a plane is invisible, but you know, so it makes sense that the inventor of radar then would come from, you know, Uranus and Scorpio. He'd come from a time when these sort of inventions happen, and then he would actually himself invent a you know, a method of remaining undetected, you know, or being able to detect enemy aircraft, you know, without them knowing. Anyway, so how did he become like this big deal, you know, with Mars? He was the advisor to the Royal Air Force on the use of radar to detect aircraft. So, I mean, he had a very big, like, kind of more powerful role. Even though he wasn't a general, he was, in essence, sort of like one. He convinced the Royal Air Force to implement an air defense system using radar, and some people said that the invention of radar was instrumental to the Allied victory in World War II. After Pearl Harbor, Watson Watt was sent to the U.S. to advise on their radar air defenses. And Ian Brown, the aviation historian, said, at that time it was said that the atomic bomb had ended the war, but it was radar that had won it. It was the most important weapon of the entire war. And of course, Mars we associate with weapons. And so, you know, Robert Watson Watt had it as his ascendant ruler in the 10th, having this very important, prominent position, you know, in the military, directing the use of, you know, this weapon that allowed the British and the Americans to capitalize on, you know, having a technology that the other side didn't. All right, now what's crazy is, while John Douglas's birth time is rated C, I just wanted to include it because I thought it was so weird, because he's born April 6th, 1892, and Robert Watson Watt was born April 13th, 1892. So literally the same week, practically, this guy was born. He was an engineer, a wartime industrialist. So he was born with Aries Rising with Mars and Capricorn 10th, and he was the chief civilian aeronautical engineer for the U.S. Army Signal Corps, and he founded the Douglas Aircraft Company, and he was basically solely responsible for, like, the modernization of American aircraft production lines. So he ended up becoming the dominant manufacturer of airplanes and missiles for the American war effort in World War II. He was able to outproduce, you know, the enemies. William S. Knudsen said, "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." And then Donald Douglas himself kind of took pride in the fact that, you know, he didn't know himself. You know, here's proof that free men can outproduce slaves. And, you know, had this very prominent struggle with Boeing, which he eventually lost. But it just kind of goes to show, like, so on the one hand, we had a guy who, like, made this invention. This guy made this invention which changed the course of the war, you know, to be able to, you know, he created a weapon. And then this guy, also had a massive role as the CEO of a major corporation which provided the defense of the country, provided for, made weapons and planes for the war effort. So I just think that's pretty amazing. If Donald Douglas is actually born at this time, that would be a pretty amazing thing that, these two people were born within a week of each other with the same rising sign, with the same ascendant ruler, and ended up kind of having a similar impact on their country's like defenses and weaponry. So I thought that was, I don't know, pretty cool. So that's that. Next up is Aries Rising with Mars in Aquarius, the 11th house.